Now that you've seen how to create an object as an attribute inside of another object, which we did in our previous video called Objects Within Objects, let's learn how to make an array of objects. And I'm going to go ahead and use that same file that we used before called object.html. And you can go watch that file and it will tell you what all this HTML means that you created, which is just going to be some field sets with legends and some labels and inputs to get a first name, a last name, and a GPA, and a button to add student, and then another one that will get a course number and a course grade, and a button to add a course, and then another button at the top that just displays the students. So go watch that previous video, Objects Within Objects, because we're just going to talk about the JavaScript we need for working with an array of objects. So the very first thing I want to do, if you remember right, we said that this was a global variable called student, and it was going to represent a student object. Well, we're going to change that because we're going to have an array of student objects. And remember, I use Hungarian notation, so I'm going to put a little a there, and I'm going to say that that's equal to an array. So this right now just says someday this variable is going to have an array. We don't know what yet, but it's going to be an array. We have our person class with our two attributes, first name and last name. We have our student class, which inherits from the person class, so it gets first name and last name, and it adds GPA, and we had an attribute called grades, and this is where we said it was equal to a new grades, course grades object. Well, we're going to make this an array. So this attribute is really going to be an array of something. We don't know what yet, but it's going to be an array. And what we're going to do in the future is make this an array of course grade objects. Because remember our previous video, we said our university, you only take one course and then you graduate. Well, not realistic. So you're going to have a bunch of course objects for one student. And you can have a bunch of student objects. Each student object in the array of AO student will have an array of grade objects. Within the grade object, which will be based upon the course grades class, there'll be a course number and a letter grade, which we learned in our previous video. So now let's come down into our function. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to create a local variable. I'm going to call it oStudent. You can call it anything you want. Now remember, we don't have the variable called oStudent anymore. We changed it to be AOStudent. And I just closed my email window, so you shouldn't hear that annoying sound anymore. So remember, we don't have a student object that we created because we changed the name to AOStudent and we said it's going to be an array. So down here we're going to make a local variable, call it oStudent, and we're going to create a student object. So it now will have a GPA, a first name, a last name, and a grades attribute, which will be an array someday. Right now it's just an empty array. So we said oStudent.firstName because we have access to the first name attribute for the student object. Remember, we got that from the person class because it was inherited. Student inherited from person, so it got those attributes. And then we grabbed the value from the first input. The ID of first and the ID of last went into the last name attribute. And if you don't understand this, please watch the previous video. Then we said oStudent.GPA was equal to the value from the GPA. One thing I didn't point out on the previous video, though, was that I converted that to a float. Otherwise, it would come back as a string. And then I said, let's go ahead and go to the element in the DOM with the ID of course number and set focus. So we drop down into the DOM and we're going to set focus. However, there's something we want to do before we leave, and that is we want to go ahead and use our global variable AOStudent. And remember that AOStudent right here we said is an array, and so we want to go ahead and push the student object to that array. So this will now allow us to have an array of student objects. Every time they click Add Student, we'll create a new student object, load up the attributes, and store it or push it onto the AOStudent global array. let's go ahead and now learn how to add course objects to a student. So the first thing I want to do in here now is create a variable. I'll call it oCourseGrade, and I'm going to create a brand new course grades object. Now remember, that was our class up here, course grades. And once you create a course grades object, you're going to have a course num attribute and a letter grade attribute. So I created that brand new object, and so now I want to say oCourseGrade, that's my variable, dot course num, that's the attribute for the variable. Remember, the variable holds a course grades object. That's one of the attributes. And I want to go ahead and get the course num from the DOM and store it to that attribute. And then I'll do the same thing for the letter grade. So now I've loaded the course num and the letter grade attributes for the course grade object that we created right here. I'm now going to put a little error check in that says if AO student, remember AO student was our global array that's supposed to hold student objects, if the length of it is greater than 0, everything's going to be fine and we're going to go do something. Otherwise, things are not fine, so we're just going to do an alert box that says please add a student. And let's go ahead and go to the DOM, and we'll do a get element by ID, and we want to set focus to the input that has the ID first. And that way, if they don't have a student added yet, it would come up to this input where they can start typing in a student name. In here, we're saying we do have a student object. So since we have a student object, let's go ahead and access the student array. And remember, to access a student array or an array, you have to specify the index. We want to work with the last student that was added, the last student object. And what we could do is say, well, access the array.length minus 1. For instance, if the length was equal to 1, that means we added one student. But remember that arrays are 0-based. So if you wanted to access the first element in the array, you'd have to access position 0. Let me say that one more time. If the length was equal to 1, that means we have one object in the array. Its element position is really 0. So that's why I said take the length of the array minus 1. So the first time we add a student, we'll access AO student square bracket 0 square bracket. That gets me the student object. Remember, the student object has an attribute called grades. Grades is an array. It's an empty array, but it's an array. But what I could do, since it's an empty array, is I could push the new grade object, the new course grades object that I just created. So this now would do something like buckwheat GPA 3.5 has a grades object with the course num of 100. This is if we typed all this in the form, and the letter grade of an A. And then if we did it again, maybe we did Spanky Spam, GPA at 3.2, and it could have its own course num of 100 and a letter grade of a B. But the interesting thing is, since this grades attribute is really going to be an array, that means it could actually hold multiple elements. So going back to buckwheat, when we run this program, it could have one course and maybe it has another course. And you could do the same for spam or for Spanky. And so since grades is an attribute that is an empty array, every time we click on add course, we're simply pushing a new course object for the current student object. So you could have a whole bunch for each one. We'll see this run in just a minute. The last thing we want to do then is we want to display the information. Now, what we're going to do for this information, since we have two arrays we're working with, an array of students and an array of courses, I'm going to go create two variables. I'm going to have one called student count and another one called course count. And I'll go ahead and use this variable, the output, to keep track of the data we're going to display. Our first loop, I'm going to tab this in, don't forget curly braces. Our first loop says we're going to start the student count at 0, and as long as the count is less than the array of students length, we'll drop in and do the loop and increment our counter. What I'm going to do on this first one is I'm going to go ahead and display the student name. Now, how do you do that? You go to the student array, access an element in the student array, which that part returns a student object. The student object has an attribute called last name. So if we were working with this and we had 0 student objects that we've added, we wouldn't even do the loop. But every time we click add, we push a new student object into this array. First time through, we grab the one in position 0, access its last name, access its first name. Then what we want to do is we want to go ahead and grab all of the course objects associated with one student. So here's how I would do that. I would have another loop, and in this loop I would have a course count starting at 0, and as long as course count was less than the student object, that's the current student object, right? There's the array of students. We're working with whichever student object is in position iStudentCount. First time is 0. Then we say go to the grades attribute, which is an array. Does it have any elements in the array for that student? If so, we drop into here and keep building our string. We say go to the student object that we're working with, access the grades attribute, which is an array, access the array object 0 of course count, because remember course count starts at 0, and grab the course num attribute. So once again, this says grab the course num attribute for the grade object in position 0 of the student object in position 0. And we build that string. The rest of this is the same. If there was another course for that student, it would then say for student 0, go grab the second grade object, grades bracket 1 bracket dot course num. When we're done with that student, we come up, increment student count, go grab the next student, and go grab all of their courses. Now let's see how this would actually run in the debugger, and I think it might make a little bit more sense to you. First name, Buckwheat, GPA 3.5. Remember, if I didn't have a student yet, watch if I click add course. It says please add a student. Add the student, set focus to course num. Course num 100, got an A, add course. Course num 101, got an A, add course. Course num 102, got an A minus, add course. So we just added 3 courses for Buckwheat. I did a Control-Shift-I, and I want to go look at our array that you're working with. So let's go ahead and set a breakpoint in add student right when we go to push, and let's set a breakpoint right here where we go to add the course, and let's do the next student. Spanky Spam 3.2 add student. Here's our current array. It says we have one element in position 0. We have a student object with the attribute first name of Buck, the attribute last name of Wheat, GPA of 3.5, and a grades attribute which has 3 array elements in it. Let's go ahead and execute this line where we just pushed. Now we have 2 elements in the array. A student object in position 0, a student object in position 1. There's Spanky, Spam, 3.2. It does not have any course grades array objects yet. So let's continue running this. Let's drop to here. Course 100, we'll say Spanky got a C, add course. We drop into this loop and we say, go to the student, the length, which is 2, minus 1. So we're going to work with Spanky, Spam, because that's position 1, right? Here's our student. In position 1 is Spanky. So we go to the Spanky student object. We access the grades object for Spanky, Spam. Now if you remember, Spanky, Spam currently has no elements in it for the grades. So we're going to push a brand new course grade object which has course number 100, course grade C. Let's push it, and now let's look at that array. Here's Spanky Spam. It has grades. It has a course grades object in it. It has one of them. Here's the object with the course number of 100 and C. Let's run this and add another course. Let's add course 200. Spanky got a B in that. Add course. We drop down to here. I executed that line. Here's Spanky Spam. Now has 2 course grade objects in the array. In position 0 is that object which has those values. In position 1 is that object which has those values. So now when I go and run the display students, it should go and grab the right objects. So I clicked on display student. We're right here waiting to execute because I have a breakpoint there. Let's step. It says the length. We have a problem with AO students. And that's because I copied code in. So I need to go and fix that. Which this is a great thing about the debugger, is that you can actually see the errors that you have and you know exactly where to go fix it. This would help you in your homework, on your test, in your career. So let's hop out real fast. We'll come back to here, and that's because I changed the name to be AO student rather than students. So make sure you change that on all of this code. So all in this section should be AO student instead of AO students. Let's save that. I'm going to run it one more time, and I'm just going to type in the data quickly. Control-Shift-I. I still want to go ahead and leave that breakpoint there. And if I remember correctly, we had Buck and Wheat with the 3.5 GPA. We added a student. We added the course of an A, course number 1 of an A, course number 2 of an A minus. We came up here and we said let's go add Spanky and Spam, who had a GPA of 3.2. And we said course number 100 had a C. Course number 101 had a B. And so we should have all of our data loaded up now inside that AO student array. Let's go ahead and click Display Students. Let's just confirm. There's object 0, which is Buckwheat, with their course objects. Here's object 1, which is Spanky Spam, which their course objects. We drop into our loop because we said the length of the array of student has 2. There's 2 student objects in it. Let's go grab the student, position 0, and grab the last name for it. And then go grab the student object, position 0, the first name. So S output now equals Buck, comma, Wheat, and then we appended on our break. Now we drop into the second loop. The second loop says, let's start this variable at 0. Does the student object in 0, which is buckwheat, have a length for grades? It does. And so we want to go ahead and drop into the loop now because 3 is greater than 0. We drop into our loop. We say go to the buckwheat object, grab the grades object in buckwheat, which has 3 array elements, go to position 0 and grab that object which has 2 attributes and display it out. We do that. We drop in and now say course count is 1. So now it goes and grabs the next grades object in the student object and accesses its attributes. And it continues this process for all of the grade objects for the current student. Then it goes to the next student. Let's watch. We finish that student. Now we drop into the next student. And now we go grab all of their grade objects. Let's go ahead and run it. And there's our buckwheat and our Spanky Spam. So this is how you can actually create an array. I made it global. You have a base class, which is generic, a student class based upon the generic class, so student becomes more specific. It has an attribute of an array, and then we go ahead and create a student object, push it to the global array. We create a course object and push it to the grades array for the student object. And we continue that process for all of the courses for a student, and then we print all of the grade objects for the student objects.